Do you believe in climate change? Whether you believe in it or not, it's going to have an effect upon you. So join me as I talk about the psychology of climate change. Thank you, Susan, for coming on the show today. I wonder if we can start by perhaps you telling me a bit about what your background in this area is and how it is that you came to be involved in this report.
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me and for doing a podcast on this topic. I have been studying the psychology of environmental issues for some time. My background is in social psychology. And so the focus of this report is on mental health, which wasn't directly in my main area, but the idea that people's exposure to environmental conditions has impacts on their psychological state is very interesting to me and something I really wanted to look into further. So when I was invited to participate in drafting this report, it seemed like a no-brainer to me.
And it's a very wide-ranging report, but I do notice that the APA did a report in 2014 as well on a very similar topic. So I'm wondering, what was the reason for another report on this so soon after 2014?
Right. Well, the earlier report, I think, was also Eco America was also responsible for that, if I'm talking about the same report that you are. And their thought, and I agreed with this, was that there had just been a lot more research. It's really something that people are becoming more and more aware of at a rapidly increasing rate. So even in the past 3 years, there was a lot more to talk about. We also wanted to take a slightly different slant in the second report, stressing the inequities of the impacts of climate change, and also saying a little bit more about how we thought people should be preparing for climate change.
That's right. And I think that's a similar reading that I had, is that often the research and the reports perhaps looks at the impacts and then the response. And I think you've taken a different lens on this report. But maybe we can just start off on that, very briefly, because I think that the other stuff is what's interesting, the new stuff. But very briefly, what are the sorts of impacts and responses that people may experience as a result of the increasing effects of climate change, and also the more that we know about it?
Right. So what we did was to divide climate change impacts up into two categories, and there are multiple other ways you could talk about it. But we when you think about the geophysical impacts of climate change, some of those include increases in natural disasters, something you're very familiar with. And then others are more gradual and even subtle, such as increased average temperatures, increases in sea level, and changing patterns of precipitation. So when you think about those two categories of effects, it's not surprising, I think, to many people that natural disasters have impacts on mental health. And now, obviously, not every natural disaster is linked to climate change, but the rate of them will increase with climate change. So there's lots of research on the kinds of impacts that natural disasters can have on mental health, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, suicide, as well as things that are more related to sort of community and social well-being, like domestic violence, and so on. But then the more gradual changes, like rises in temperature and so on, were not something that people, I think, have been considering the ways in which they'll impact mental health for the most part. But if you think about these changes, it becomes clear that they probably will have an impact on mental health. We have a lot of evidence, for example, that rises in average temperatures are associated with increased aggression and violence, and not only sort of aggression directed outwardly, but aggression directed inwardly. So there's increases in suicide rates, for example. And then, a lot of research, particularly from the sort of Australia, was focusing on some of the mental health impacts of people who are affected by drought, which is sort of a middle point between the natural disaster and the very slow gradual impacts. How are people affected by the land that they know and are familiar with drying out? And this research was emphasized the effects on farmers, of course, who are more directly impacted. And you see things like increased suicide rates. But then the more perhaps subtle effects of just changes in the land, that's what the research is only just beginning to be able to look at. And most of it is more suggestive than conclusive at this point. But people talk about things like just sadness and anxiety associated with these changes to their familiar environments.
It's hugely topical here in New Zealand. We've experienced a whole series of floods over the last couple of weeks. We've seen a regional distribution pattern of that rainfall and where it's falling is changing because we're also experiencing drought at the same time, which is confusing for people when they think about, well, what are the global impacts of climate change and how is that expressed in our particular locality? And I think also one of the things that you've talked about there is the impact of the secondary stresses. So it's not necessarily the event itself, but the consequences of that event for people's lives. And as you say, it's over an extended period of time as people come to terms or not with how it is that where they live and how the behaviour of the climate and the weather patterns that they were used to, and the implications for things like food security, which is what you've noticed, but also things like weakened infrastructure. Where stop banks for rivers perhaps aren't able to do the job that they were doing before because of the increased load and pressure on that infrastructure.
Exactly right. Yes, the food insecurity, the impacts on infrastructure. I think people are beginning to recognize the threats of changes in disease vectors that are associated with climate change, and a lot of these things, of course, have direct impacts on physical health. But then the stress of having to deal with them or even worrying about them can put a great burden on mental health as well. And the other thing I want to be sure to bring up is that we know that climate change is associated with increases in migration. That's already happening, and will happen even more as some areas are submerged by rising seas, or desertification essentially renders them uninhabitable. And migration is something that we know is very stressful and associated with threats to mental health.
And these are played out over national borders as well. It's not just within a country, but people moving across what were, artificial borders between countries. But also, these are big climate affected areas that share these changes that are going on between different, river catchments, between different mountain ranges. All of these things, these geographical features play a much bigger role perhaps now than we have been used to compared to the national boundaries.
Right. And I think we probably as a species, humans, certainly as a modern species, we tend to ignore the impacts of our environments. I mean, we're aware of being uncomfortable if it's too hot or too cold, or being annoyed if we don't get the right amount of rain that we want. But we tend not to think about the ways in which we're just affected on a day-to-day basis by environmental conditions. So it's not surprising that we're not necessarily conscious of the ways in which changes in those conditions are also going to affect us.
And that's interesting because I think it speaks to some of the other impacts that you talk about in the report, is the accumulation of these impacts that can lead to these experiences of fatalism, helplessness, resignation, fear, conflict avoidance, but also, as you say, increases in conflict and aggression too. And we actually talked about that in the first podcast of this series. I interviewed Dr. Matt Williams, and we specifically talked about the impacts of climate change on aggression, both interpersonally, but also intergroup. And I think you talk about that in your report too.
Absolutely. One of the things that I really, or we as the authors of the report really wanted to do was to expand the concept of mental health and talk about psychosocial well-being more generally. What kinds of things are associated with being, happy or unhappy, functional or less functional. And so it's not just things like PTSD and suicide or even depression. It's just those levels of stress, the ability to rely on our interpersonal relationships and thinking about the ways in which those might be affected by climate change. Thinking about the increases in intergroup tensions that are associated with these eco-migrations and with the increased competition for environmental resources.
And that brings me to thinking about what the report says about those broader social settings that have an influence upon how people are affected or exposed to the risks of climate change. Those socioeconomic and demographic inequalities that exist in our societies. How do they play out in how you imagine the impacts might be, or how they're playing out right now?
Right. And I think this, too, is something that people are not as aware of as perhaps they should be, which is that not everybody is going to be equally affected by climate change. Clearly, people are already being affected around the world, and people who are unlucky enough to be geographically vulnerable are the ones who are feeling the effects first. So some people just live in more vulnerable areas. But it's not just that there are geographical vulnerabilities. There are also social vulnerabilities. So, for example, if you have fewer economic resources, you're less able to protect yourself or to cope with the consequences of climate change. Something as simple as, and there are parts of the world in which people can't afford to have air conditioners. They're obviously going to be more strongly affected by increases in heat. The ability to buy bottled water is certainly going to be a big help for some people, and so on. So there's definitely those economic inequalities. And then recognizing that some people are essentially more vulnerable by virtue of their individual characteristics. So children are definitely more vulnerable to a lot of the impacts of climate change. And people who have sort of pre-existing problems, whether those be physical health problems or some mental health problems, can make them more physiologically vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
So can we just focus on children for a second? As you mentioned, how are they more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change?
Well, again, they're vulnerable sort of physiologically because they're young and their systems are still developing. And just as we know, I think most of us recognize that a fetus is very vulnerable to environmental influences, and that's why we have high standards for how pregnant women should behave. Because while the systems are developing, a sort of small amount of a toxin or a small amount of an impact can have a large and, in some cases, irreversible impact on the developing system. So the same is true for young children, that if they experience trauma or malnutrition at a young age, they may never fully recover. They may never reach the level that they would have reached otherwise. They're also more, their systems are in some cases not as functional, so they're less good at regulating their own body temperature and therefore more susceptible to the effects of heat. And then they're more kind of socially vulnerable because of their dependence on others. So when their social networks are affected, for example, by stressors in the community, if the community is disrupted by the effects of climate change, or if there's been a natural disaster and the family has been relocated, the children are less able to cope without the help of their primary caregivers, or at least a substitute caregiver. They are also vulnerable to these sort of vicarious impacts. If their caregivers are stressed, that often impacts the children as well.
And we've certainly seen that here in New Zealand. And I guess what you're saying here is that, those developmental trajectories can be nudged at a very early stage in these children's lives, such that they perhaps don't end up in as good a place as they would have done had this not happened. And the mechanisms by which that might occur are multiple. And one of those that we've seen here certainly is that as parents and other caregivers, because the social connectedness is wide, right? When we're thinking about influences on children's lives, they are distracted or otherwise taken up and stressed by trying to sort out the impacts of the particular event that they've gone through, this particular single event or multiple events. And then suddenly 2-3 years later, they have this awareness and awakening moment that actually perhaps they've not been on top of what's been going on for their child as they could have been. And a lot of people are racked with guilt around that when suddenly they say, oh my gosh, there's this thing that's been signaled to me by the teacher or by another parent that's going on for my child, and I hadn't noticed this. So it's actually quite disturbing for everyone when this happens.
Right. I mean, if you're focused on your own, personal survival for one reason or another, I think parents, most parents would not abandon their child, but they might not be able to be thinking about the well-being of the child in as comprehensive a way. They might just be doing the best they can, and that means letting some other things fall off the radar. And then even some very direct effects. So if the educational system is disrupted, again, maybe by a natural disaster, then the child may lose some schooling and never quite get back to that level that they would have otherwise.
Mm. One of the things that we've talked about a bit here is the geography. And I guess one interesting thing that you've emphasized here is people's attachment to place and the importance of place, not just their lived place, and at this point in time, but also I'm thinking about indigenous cultures and their attachment to place and what that place means practically as well as symbolically, but also occupational attachment to place as well. There are certain things that you may only be able to do in certain places. And I think that that's a really interesting and welcome addition to this report. Perhaps you could speak a bit more about some of those place concepts that you were trying to get across.
Yeah, I too think this is a really interesting aspect of how we're going to be affected by climate change, and something that I suspect we're going to be learning more about in the next few years. As you mentioned, some people are tied to location by virtue of their occupation. So anybody who works in close contact with the land, farmers or fishers, or maybe people working in the tourism industry, they're not only are they more exposed to the effects of environments by the virtue of just being outdoors, but their jobs, the nature of their jobs, may have to change as the climate changes, and that requires a little bit of readjustment of our self-image, because we're so closely tied to what we do. If we can't do exactly that thing anymore, it might sort of shake up our sense of self and our sense of stability. But it's not just occupation that ties us to place. Many people feel some sort of place attachment or place identity in which they define themselves according to the place they live in. Our roots, if you will, to those places partly define us. They give us a sense of security because usually we have learned how to live in that place. And when things change about that place, it may again shake that sense of security, shake our confidence that we know how to live in that place. So if you're used to, shoveling a certain amount of snow from your walk, or if you're used to the time that you plant your garden every spring and the climate changes and those things change, you might not feel quite as much at home in that place as you were. And, that we have lots of language that talks about how important it is to feel that sense of being at home. We talk about feeling alienated or rootless or not being grounded. So I think that kind of sadness associated with losing a place is only just beginning to be the topic of research, but I think we're going to find out more about how important that is. And then just you mentioned indigenous cultures, and I think this is where the research is kind of beginning to take note, because indigenous cultures are often more closely tied to the natural environment and the rhythms of that environment. They are more likely to find that their lives are disrupted when the environment changes, and sometimes in very concrete ways if they have to move, as is in the case for a lot of Alaskan natives, for example, because their homes are essentially disappearing as the permafrost is melting. But so they're not just losing the place that's important to them, their culture, because it's so bound up in that place, is also threatened. And that can be an important source of kind of mental stability and support.
Particularly, I think, if those indigenous cultures have had to survive and go through many different kinds of threat and assault on their way of a life and being, and that culture and knowledge of how they are connected to that land. It's interesting to me in that I've looked at this a little bit in the work that we've done, is that their language and their concepts around the attachment to land and what happens when you lose it they have, unfortunately, you could say, a much wider range of ways of expressing that, because it's experienced for them quite acutely and over a long period of time, and it's talked about. Whereas I think perhaps certainly me, as somebody who's a migrant, who's moved 2 generations down from where my parents were from, but they would have had various multiple migrations before that, often our language leaves us adrift, such that we can't necessarily describe our experience particularly well. And that leaves us with a sense of uncertainty around what is happening. What is my experience about?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. There is some research suggesting that the ability to talk about one's experiences or to maybe to write about them, helps us cope with them and incorporate them into who we are. So if we don't have the language to describe the kinds of feelings of uncertainty and loss that we're feeling, it can be harder to cope with them. It's interesting, though. I was talking to a reporter about this topic just the other day, about how we might respond to changes in our environment. And she said, yes, she lives in Washington, D.C., and in Washington, D.C., the cherry blossoms are a big deal. They are, supposed to bloom at a particular time of the year. And she said she and her husband got married at cherry blossom blooming time. And so she was very upset that the cherry blossoms didn't seem to be blooming at the same time that they used to. So their, anniversary was not occurring at that time. This year, the cherry blossoms all got wiped out by an inopportune snowstorm. And so it's a much smaller, kind of more trivial example in some ways, but it does show the sort of confusion and disorientation you can start to feel when you notice your environment changing around you.
It does, doesn't it? And as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the rhythm that is set by what's going on around us. And when those basic rhythms are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, it upsets everything around what it is that we expect around our environment. Yeah.
Yes.
So you also talk about this interesting, if we zoom in upon, the individual, but also, how people talk about this with other people, which is what we're talking about here. This interesting idea around psychological distancing. And you talk a little bit in the report about this nexus between perception, politics, and uncertainty, and how they relate to this idea of psychological distancing. So perhaps you could explain a little bit more about psychological distancing and how all of these things contribute to that and what the impacts might be.
Yeah, sure. And this was definitely one of the reasons that, or one of the motivations for the report. I think that, nobody or very few people are positive about climate change, but there's not been a great deal of really vivid concern. There's something more like apathy. And I think that apathy stems from a psychological distance that is a product of ignorance, and that And the research shows us that many people feel that that climate change is something that's going to happen to people who are not like them, in a place that's far away at some time in the future. So it's sort of distant on all kinds of dimensions, and that perceptual distance allows us to ignore it and not feel the degree of concern that I think we should be feeling. And this distance is encouraged, I would say, by politicians who would rather not have to deal with it, and in some cases want to, use it as a political tool. I would say to. I don't want to get too much into politics and the nefarious things that politicians do, but we know that that politicians are not above saying things purely to compete with their opposing parties. And so climate change has become this political tool to create greater distance between, different public groups, as opposed to something that we can all come together and talk about as something that we'll all be, similarly affected by. So the distance is there because, in part, of the ignorance, and the apathy is there in part because of the distance. And the distance is maintained, I think, in part for political reasons.
Hmm. And it also feeds into this idea of worldviews, I think, as well as and ideologies that act as filters to help to increase or decrease the concern, and perhaps motivate, or as you say, demotivate us towards action. And this area is called motivated cognition, I believe. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, because it's relevant to this report and appears here too.
Right. So these attempts to create distance wouldn't work if we weren't, in some ways, if we didn't want to maintain this distance from climate change. And motivated cognition or motivated reasoning refers very generally to the fact that our even when we think we're thinking rationally about something, our cognitive processes are affected by our motivations, so that we select the kinds of information that we want to pay attention to, rather than paying attention to all information equally. We select the information that helps support the beliefs we want to maintain and the worldview we want to have. So certainly most people want to believe that their life is not going to change drastically and they're going to be safe. And to the extent that climate change threatens those beliefs, people don't want to believe in it. Also, it became associated with political parties because, different political parties have different attitudes about government intervention and social welfare. And if you believe in climate change, it probably makes some sense to think that the government should do something about it. So people who don't believe in government intervention are motivated not to believe that.
And we've seen this play out, haven't we, in recent elections, both in the USA. We've seen that play out in Brexit in the UK. Mm-hmm. It's a worry in that people select information that bolsters the view that they already hold, because then it means that they are justified in doing nothing because they can continue with their worldview. And unfortunately, the way that the algorithms are working now in the internet is that because they want you to stay reading and stay watching and stay on that particular platform, is that you get presented with information that reifies and confirms the view that you already have. And there are some thoughts around how it is that we can combat that. But one of the issues is around information that is packaged in a way that doesn't necessarily speak truth, but actually just wants you to feel more satisfied with what it is that you're reading and makes you feel better.
Absolutely. And I think at this point in time, motivated reasoning has really kind of got out of hand, because there is a sense that there is no single truth, that there are multiple truths, and everybody can pick and choose the ones they like best. So there's been, I think, a real devaluing of the idea that scientific knowledge is objective, and if the scientists say something is probably true. And if we don't believe that, then why should we believe in climate change? And it just makes us feel uncomfortable. So let's choose not to believe in it.
Yeah, and I think it's a real conundrum for psychologists and psychology as a discipline, because on the one hand there is this idea of the objective reality and truth, and this is undeniable that this is happening, yet we realize that we are beings that have cognitive biases. We understand that there are multiple points of views and multiple realities, and we are able to hold arguments and debates around which truth takes dominance here in terms of making decisions about what we're going to do, and psychologists recognize this. So it's an interesting place that we find ourselves, I think, as people who are working to make sense of behavior of individuals and groups, and how we respond to challenges like this.
Yeah, exactly. And psychologists are also subject to biases and believing things more when they're consistent with their worldviews, but that's why we have things like peer review and multiple studies, so that there can be a dialogue back and forth, and we can hopefully have our biases corrected by our peers.
And I think that's a really important point you're making in terms of, as part of the scientific process, these ideas are exposed to our colleagues and our peers, and they look at that with rigor. And with multiple points of view. So it's not just an opinion here. And I think that's a really important point. There's much that we could talk about in the report, but I'm also aware of time. But I just want to go over the recommendations that you make here. There are tips to support individuals, tips to support communities, and what people can do. But also, I think there's a really interesting section here on what mental health and other professional leaders can do, and the ethics involved in that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about there, so where you see the role of mental health and other professionals. What could we be doing here? What should we be doing here, in your view?
Well, I think the broadest point is that mental health professionals need to be aware of challenges to mental health. They need to be, proactively paying attention to these new threats and being alert to the possibility that these are impacting people's mental health, and preparing themselves and training themselves to be able to cope with those mental health challenges. And then, in addition, I think that mental health professionals are respected, and that respect gives us a certain responsibility to have our voices heard about this topic. So I think that recognizing that this is a health issue, that climate change is a health issue, mental health professionals can have their voices perhaps be more weighty on this topic than if they were just any uninvolved citizen. So I really think that both preparing as professionals and then using their role as professionals to speak to those who have the power to do something about it is what I would hope mental health professionals would do.
And I think that I agree with you. I think we do have a responsibility here. And I think there are different dangers in downplaying the mental health impacts here, because I think that what you've done here is you've widened the scope of the sorts of issues that we should be considering as being affected by climate change. So you mentioned decision making here, and how decision making can be affected by increased arousal, and how that process is changed completely. So yeah, there are multiple impacts here, and the economic case for depression, and how much that costs to treat, and how much that impacts upon people's lives, such that suicide perhaps becomes a risk for a minority of people, but a very real risk, and perhaps an increasing risk too.
Right.
Is there any take homes that you would like to send to our listeners around this report, particularly around what it is that they could do, and any tips that are offered in the report?
Yeah, well, I would say the biggest take home is that we're hoping for is to encourage a sense of urgency or importance. that this is not a topic that we can really afford to ignore and hope somebody else will take care of, that we really need to do something about it. But I also want people to feel a sense of hope and possibility. So the kinds of effects we talk about in this report are not inevitable. You don't have 100% of people who are affected by drought, committing suicide or engaging in domestic violence. You don't have 100% of children affected by natural disasters, ruining their lives. So what we need to do is to be aware of the possibilities for resilience and sort of combine that feeling of urgency and the feeling of hope to actually get prepared, get involved and get prepared for the kinds of effects that climate change is going to have.
I think it's a really good message to finish with, because I think the research that we recently published for the New Zealand government indicated that the general consensus is that around about 80% of people who go through single event disasters are okay, so long as they are connected to those basic supports, such as food, such as water, such as security, adequate shelter and housing. But one of the really pivotal things is the social connectedness, that they stay connected with the people that they normally get support from, but also those communities who are affected too. Well, so there's the hope. What we don't know, I think, and I think what you're signaling is that climate change happening over a longer period of time is perhaps going to exert a different set of risks and a different set of factors and affect not just individuals, but whole regions and communities who are going through this together.
That's right. And so I think everybody can, at the very least, get informed about what they can expect in their particular region in the near to midterm, and then prepare themselves for those impacts, and ideally connect with other people, as you say, those social networks being so important in maintaining our own mental health as well as coping with the impacts of climate change. And finally, I would hope people would get involved at whatever level they're comfortable with, but communicate to the relevant authorities that this is a problem that we need to be taking action on.
Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you found that really interesting. Don't forget to like if you have found it interesting or useful, and subscribe to make sure you don't miss any more videos from me. Thanks again for watching. Catch you again next time.